200,000 children. That's the number historians agree on. Not migrants crossing oceans, not refugees escaping war, children already inside America, moved, quietly, for 75 years. We're told it was charity. We're told industrial cities were collapsing. We're told poverty left reformers no choice. And all of that is true. But something feels heavier when you sit with the scale, because charity doesn't usually last 3 generations. And emergency relief doesn't normally require a logistics system stretching across an entire continent. The first orphan train left New York in 1854. At that moment, Manhattan was a pressure chamber. Immigration was exploding. Irish famine survivors poured into overcrowded tenements. Factories expanded faster than housing. Disease moved quickly through narrow alleys. Child labor wasn't hidden. It was normal. Boys sold newspapers in the cold. Girls stitched garments in dim factories. Some slept on rooftops in summer heat, because rooms below were unbearable. The streets were full of children. Observers called them street Arabs. Unclaimed, unstable. Charles Loring Brace believed he had found the solution. Environment shapes destiny. Remove children from urban vice. Place them in rural Christian homes. Break the cycle. It sounded moral. It sounded progressive. It sounded necessary. So the trains began. Children were gathered in groups, given modest clothing, placed on westbound railcars. At each stop, communities were notified in advance. Church halls filled. Families assembled. Children stood in lines while adults observed them. Are you strong? Can you read? Are you obedient? Decisions were made quickly. Imagine being 8 years old and realizing your future depends on a stranger's glance. Some were embraced immediately. Some were passed over. Some were separated from siblings permanently. This was not modern adoption. It was placement, often informal, often loosely monitored. Now pause. If this were a short-term rescue effort, it would have faded once conditions improved. But it didn't. It continued. Year after year, decade after decade, for 75 years, 200,000 children relocated between 1854 and 1929. That is not a temporary solution. That is infrastructure. Let's slow the math down. 75 years. Roughly 2,600 children every year. Every year for 3 generations. Systems don't run that long unless they are serving something deeper than crisis response. Now look at what else was happening at the exact same time. Railroads were expanding aggressively westward. The Homestead Act opened millions of acres. New territories needed population thresholds to become states. Towns formed along rail lines almost overnight, and towns require families. Children create permanence, they grow roots, they become workers, they become voters, they become the next generation of stability. Urban overcrowding was real. Frontier expansion was real. Railroads made long-distance relocation efficient. Charitable reform provided moral justification. These forces aligned, no secret memo required. Alignment is often enough. Now consider something more uncomfortable. Not every child on those trains was a true orphan. Some had one living parent. Some were surrendered during economic collapse. Some were classified as abandoned under definitions that would not survive modern scrutiny. The Panic of 1873 devastated working families. The Panic of 1893 did it again. Unemployment surged. Banks collapsed. Evictions multiplied. In that environment, surrendering a child might have felt like survival. But survival decisions made in desperation feed systems that endure far longer than the crisis itself. Temporary chaos became permanent relocation. And here's where tension builds. If industrial poverty alone created the crisis, why did relocation remain the preferred solution for decades? Why not massive urban reform? Why not wage protections? Why not housing reconstruction on equal scale? Some reforms came later. But the trains continued. That suggests relocation was not merely emergency. It was effective at relieving urban pressure, effective at supplying rural communities, effective at moving vulnerability from one place to another. The trains did not hide. They were publicized. Newspapers celebrated success stories. Photographs documented smiling placements. But scale hides in celebration. 200,000 childhoods redirected. Entire Midwestern counties today trace large portions of their ancestry to orphan train riders. 1 in 10 families in some regions. That is demographic restructuring. And yet in most history books, this movement occupies a few pages. Why? Perhaps because it complicates the myth of organic frontier growth. We prefer the image of independent pioneer families carving communities from wilderness. It is less romantic to acknowledge that many towns were quietly reinforced by relocated urban children. Now, step into the emotional layer again. Picture a child from Manhattan's Lower East Side. Noise, crowds, brick buildings pressed tight, then suddenly, fields, silence, open sky, no familiar language, no familiar faces. That is not a small transition. Some adapted beautifully. Some felt displaced their entire lives. Some changed names. Some lost contact with siblings forever. Genealogists today still encounter broken records from orphan train placements, not because of conspiracy. Because documentation was inconsistent, fragmentation reshapes memory, and memory reshapes identity. 200,000 small resets. Cumulative change is powerful. The trains slowed in the early 20th century. Foster care systems professionalized. Child labor laws tightened. Oversight increased. The program faded, but by then 3 generations had been affected. The relocated children grew up, married, built farms, opened businesses, served in wars. Their descendants now number in the millions, and many of them know only fragments of how their family story began. Here's the question that lingers quietly. Was this simply compassionate reform responding to industrial chaos, or was it compassionate reform functioning inside a much larger structural shift? Maybe both. Industrial acceleration created pressure. Expansion created demand. Railroads created possibility. Charity created narrative. And children moved within that intersection, not by choice, but by decision. 200,000 decisions made in the name of progress, made in the name of salvation, made in the name of necessity. And maybe the most unsettling realization isn't that it happened, it's that it feels smaller than it was. Because when a nation relocates a city's worth of children over 3 generations, that is not a side story, that is transformation. Quiet, gradual, train by train, year by year. And we've only examined the surface if Part 1 asked how this happened, Part 2 asks why it lasted. Because 75 years is not reaction. It is adaptation. Let's step back into the economic heart of the 19th century. America after the Civil War was not stable. It was accelerating. Railroads multiplied. Factories expanded. Immigration surged. Cities compressed. Capital flowed aggressively. And then the crashes came. The Panic of 1873. The Panic of 1893. Banks failed, railroad companies collapsed, factories shut down, unemployment surged into the hundreds of thousands. Working-class families who had barely survived now faced total collapse. In some urban districts, unemployment approached crisis levels for years. Families were evicted, charitable institutions overflowed, children were the most vulnerable. Now here's something important. Economic depressions don't create permanent orphans overnight. They create desperation, and desperation changes decisions. A father without work for months, a mother trying to feed 4 children on nothing, a reformed society offering food, clothing, and a farm home. Would you hesitate? Or would you convince yourself that temporary surrender was protection? Temporary. That word matters, because many parents believe the separation might not be permanent. But once a child boarded a westbound train, permanence became likely. And the trains did not stop when the economy recovered. They continued. That suggests something deeper than crisis management. Now look at the railroads. Railroads were not neutral transportation systems. They were political and economic power structures. The federal government granted railroad companies enormous swaths of land to incentivize westward expansion. Their profits depended on populated territory. Empty land does not generate commerce. Settled land does. Railroads needed towns. Towns needed families. Families needed children. This does not prove that railroad executives orchestrated orphan relocation, but it does reveal incentive alignment. When infrastructure exists to move people cheaply and efficiently, relocation becomes feasible. Rail lines connected New York to Kansas, Boston to Nebraska, urban pressure points to agricultural frontiers. Movement became easier than reform. Now add cultural ideology. Reformers like Charles Loring Brace believed urban immigrant families were morally compromised by environment. Rural Protestant households were viewed as corrective. This belief system justified relocation as not only economic relief, but moral salvation. So now we have three layers converging. Economic instability creating vulnerable children. A neighborhood infrastructure enabling. Cultural ideology framing removal as redemption. When three forces align, systems emerge, and systems sustain themselves. 75 years. Let's examine geography more closely. Many placements occurred in Midwestern agricultural states. Kansas, Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, Indiana. These were states transitioning from frontier to structured communities. Population growth determined political power. Children strengthened census counts. Census counts strengthened representation. Representation strengthened funding and infrastructure. Again, no secret pot required. Demographics shape politics naturally. 200,000 children inserted into rural communities over 3 generations quietly shifted political and social weight. Now consider the cultural assimilation effect. Many orphan train riders were children of Irish, Italian, German, or Eastern European immigrants. Placed into Protestant rural homes, ethnic identity softened. Urban dialect faded. Religious practices changed. Family traditions dissolved. Over time, assimilation accelerated. Was that intentional? Reformers certainly believed they were rescuing children from cultural environments they viewed as inferior. Whether that judgment was fair or biased is another question. But cultural reset was embedded in the process. 200,000 cultural resets. Cumulative change is powerful. Now let's widen the lens beyond America. During the same period, Britain exported tens of thousands of poor children to Canada and Australia, industrial centres sending vulnerable youth to expanding territories. The logic was similar. Urban poverty overwhelming. Colonial regions needing population. Charitable language masking structural redistribution. This was not uniquely American. It was a pattern of industrial societies under pressure. When cities compress too tightly, they externalize instability. Children become the most movable variable, not because they are expendable, but because they are adaptable. And adaptation is easier to manage than systemic reform. Now return to the emotional core. Picture a 12-year-old boy arriving in rural Kansas after weeks of uncertainty. He speaks with a thick urban accent. He has never farmed. He has never milked livestock. He is placed in a household where expectations are immediate. Work begins at dawn. Education depends on the family's goodwill. Some placements created lifelong bonds. Some created quiet suffering. Oversight existed but was limited. Social workers could not monitor every rural household consistently across thousands of miles. Records from the era show both glowing success stories and disturbing failures. The truth resists simplicity. Now ask this. If relocation solved urban overcrowding so effectively, why did cities continue struggling for decades? Because relocation was not root reform. It was redistribution. It moved vulnerability. It did not eliminate industrial inequality, but it relieved visible pressure. And relieving visible pressure can make a system appear stable. 200,000 children moved. Urban streets appeared slightly less chaotic. Frontier towns appeared slightly more permanent. The nation expanded, progress narratives strengthened, and the orphan trains became normalized. Normalization is powerful. When something operates long enough, it stops feeling extraordinary. But extraordinary is exactly what it was. 200,000 lives redirected. Now consider generational scale. Each relocated child grew into adulthood. Each adult had children of their own. 200,000 beginnings multiplied into millions of descendants. In some Midwestern counties, historians estimate the significant percentage of current residents trace lineage to orphan train riders. That is demographic architecture. Built quietly. Now here is the deeper tension. Was this purely compassion responding to chaos, or was compassion functioning inside expansion? The two are not mutually exclusive. Industrial acceleration fractured families. Relocation offered survival. Expansion benefited. Railroads profited. Communities stabilized. Systems aligned. History often moves through alignment, not conspiracy. But alignment can still reshape a nation profoundly. The trains eventually slowed in the early 20th century. Professional social work emerged. Child labor laws tightened. Public scrutiny increased. The system faded, but its imprint did not. And here is where Part 3 will go deeper. Because the orphan trains were not just movement of bodies, they were movement of identity, memory, narrative, origin. When 200,000 children are redistributed across a continent, the country that emerges afterwards is not the same as the one that began, and that transformation deserves more than a paragraph. When the trains finally slowed in the early 20th century, the system didn't collapse. It simply faded. No dramatic ending, no national reckoning, no official declaration that an era had closed. It just stopped. But by then, 3 generations had already been reshaped. And here is where the story becomes heavier, because movement changes geography, but displacement changes identity. 200,000 children did not just change addresses, they changed names, they changed accents, they changed religions, they changed futures. Many orphan train riders were children of immigrants, Irish, Italian, German, Eastern European. Urban Catholic communities were often seen by Protestant reformers as morally unstable environments. Relocation didn't just remove children from poverty, it removed them from culture. Placed into rural Protestant homes, language shifted. Traditions softened. Family narratives dissolved. Within a generation, origin blurred. Within 2 generations, it often disappeared. This wasn't an official assimilation program, but it functioned like one. 200,000 quiet cultural resets, and over decades resets compound. Now imagine the psychological impact. A child who grows up without a clear origin story often builds identity differently. Some embraced reinvention completely. Others carried quiet questions for life. Many orphan train riders later described a strange duality, gratitude for opportunity, but a lingering sense of disconnection. Where did I begin? Who was I before the train? When genealogists today attempt to trace orphan train ancestry, they often encounter gaps. Missing birth certificates, changed surnames, inconsistent census records. Not because of deliberate erasure, because the system was informal. Loose paperwork, overstretched oversight, fragmented documentation. But fragmentation has consequences. It creates silence, and silence reshapes national memory. Now zoom out again. Think about how we are taught American expansion. We hear about pioneers, about settlers, about bravery and independence, but rarely about the steady relocation of urban children into frontier communities, rarely about demographic reinforcement through structured movement. History compresses complexity. It favors clean narratives. Industrial growth, westward expansion, moral reform, each told separately, but the orphan trains sit at their intersection, and intersections are harder to summarize. Here is the question that lingers beneath everything. Why does this feel bigger than the space it occupies in textbooks? Because scale demands reflection. 200,000 children, 75 years, millions of descendants. That is not a side note. That is structural adaptation. Now let's step into something even quieter. When societies face pressure, they can choose reform, or they can choose redistribution. Reform requires rebuilding systems. Redistribution requires movement. Movement is faster. Movement is visible. Movement gives the appearance of solution. The orphan trains redistributed vulnerability. Urban overcrowding eased slightly. Frontier communities stabilized. Industrial pressure shifted location. The nation continued expanding. This is not accusation, it is observation. Industrial societies often manage instability by moving it, and children are adaptable. They survive relocation better than rigid systems do. But survival does not erase its impact. 200,000 childhoods were shaped by decisions made by adults under economic and cultural pressure. Some lives improved dramatically, some did not, but the demographic shift was real, and demographic shifts outlive intention. Now consider generational echo. Those relocated children grew up. They had children. Their children had children. Today, the number of Americans descended from orphan train riders is in the millions. Millions of family trees beginning in a train car. Millions of origin stories compressed into a single phrase. My grandfather came west on a train. And over time, the details faded, the emotional rupture softened, the movement normalized. That is how structural change becomes invisible, not hidden. Normalized. When something lasts long enough, it stops feeling extraordinary. But extraordinary is exactly what it was. A nation under industrial acceleration chose relocation as one of its primary tools for managing pressure, not once, not briefly, for 75 years. Now return to the original question, was it repopulation? In effect, yes, even if not officially declared. Was it industrial chaos? In origin, absolutely. Economic collapse and urban compression created the crisis. Was it compassionate reform? In intention, often. Many reformers truly believed they were saving lives. The tension exists because all three can be true simultaneously. History rarely operates on single motives. It operates on alignment. Pressure aligns with opportunity. Infrastructure aligns with ideology. Vulnerability aligns with expansion. And systems emerge. The orphan trains were a system born from alignment. Not conspiracy. Not secret empire. Alignment. An alignment can reshape a nation just as powerfully as policy. The most unsettling realization isn't that children were moved, it's that it made sense at the time. It felt practical, it felt moral, it felt efficient. And when something feels all three, it becomes normalized quickly. But normalization doesn't reduce scale. 200,000 children moved across a continent. 75 years of steady demographic adjustment. An expanding nation absorbing its own instability. That is not small. That is transformation. Quiet transformation. Train by train. Child by child. Year by year. And perhaps the reason it feels understated today is because there was no dramatic climax. No scandal that stopped it. No official apology. Just a slow fade as new welfare systems replaced it. But the demographic architecture remained. Embedded in towns, embedded in surnames, embedded in silent family gaps, the orphan trains reveal something uncomfortable but deeply human. When societies accelerate faster than their social systems can handle, they improvise. And improvisation leaves marks, some visible, some quiet, some grateful, some fractured. 200,000 stories, some told, some lost. And maybe the final question isn't whether it was right or wrong. Maybe the final question is this. What does it say about a century when moving 200,000 children felt like the most practical solution available? That question doesn't accuse, it doesn't speculate wildly. It simply asks us to look again, because scale demands reflection, and reflection demands honesty. The orphan trains were not a myth. They were not hidden. They were real. They were public. They were normalized, and they reshaped a nation more quietly than most of us realize. 200,000 children, 75 years, a continent in motion, and a country that emerged looking stable, but built partly on movement few people stopped to measure. If that feels larger than a paragraph, it's because it is.